Hi, and welcome to today's webinar, where we'll be exploring how states can meet the climate and clean energy goals found in the EPA's Clean Power Plan. My name is Dave Anderson, and I'm an outreach coordinator for the Union of Concerned Scientists Climate and Energy Program. I want to thank you all for joining us today. Before we get started, I just want to take care of a few housekeeping points at the beginning. During the presentations, all participants will be in listen-only mode. You may, however, submit questions to the speakers at any time by typing them into the chat feature located at the left of your screen. We aim to respond to clarifying questions in the chat feature during the presentation, and also conduct a longer Q&A session at the end of the webinar in which we'll answer some of your questions directly. Also, today's call is being recorded, and we'll be making the slides and audio available after the webinar. Now for a little bit of background to set the stage for today's webinar. The Clean Power Plan was finalized on August 3rd, 2015. It sets the first ever national limits on carbon dioxide emissions from power plants under the Clean Power Plan, following off of a 2009 determination by the EPA that carbon dioxide emissions pose a threat to public health and welfare. As we know, the impacts of climate change are already being felt by Americans today through heat waves, droughts, wildfires, and sea level rise. And these risks will only worsen if we fail to take strong action to curtail emissions. The CPP, or Clean Power Plan, is the linchpin of President Obama's Climate Action Plan, contributing to a global partnership to cut emissions and enable a transition to a clean energy economy. As it worked to finalize this rule, the EPA received more than 4.3 million comments and engaged in an extensive stakeholder process that helped inform the design of the Clean Power Plan. Now, states are in the driver's seat in charting their clean energy transition, which brings us to today's webinar, where we'll be hearing from two UCX experts who will be sharing their knowledge on the Clean Power Plan and what it means for states, including your own state. Our first speaker will be Steve Clemmer, who will provide a high-level overview of the provisions of and impacts of the Clean Power Plan and opportunities for states to use renewable energy and energy efficiency to affordably comply with the rule. Then we'll hear from Jeremy Richardson, who will describe our recent analysis on how far along states are towards meeting their targets in the Clean Power Plan, just based on decisions that they've already made. Then I'll be back to provide an overview on how you can help to ensure that your state seizes on this historic opportunity to act on climate change and ramp up renewable energy. Now I'll hand it over to Steve.
Great, thanks Dave. It's great to be here today to present this really important Clean Power Plan to you today. So this chart from EPA shows that the electric power sector accounted for nearly a third of total U.S. global warming emissions in 2013. And fossil fuel-fired power plants are the largest source of U.S. carbon dioxide emissions, which as you can see are responsible for over 80% of total global warming emissions. So clearly this sector is very important to address our long-term problem with climate change. The power sector is already undergoing a shift away from coal-fired power to cleaner generation sources like natural gas and renewables, primarily because of market forces, especially low natural gas prices and, importantly, the falling cost of renewable energy. The Clean Power Plan can play a role in help accelerating that shift. To also give you a point of reference, the average age of coal plants in the United States is about 43 years. The average age of oil-fired units, which there aren't too many around still, but is 46 years, while the average age of a natural gas combined cycle plant is 15 years. So just a few basics about the Clean Power Plan. The release of the plan was really a major policy victory that we celebrated this summer, and it's projected to reduce national electric carbon sector emissions by 32% below 2005 levels by 2030. As I'll show you in a second, the plan sets uniform performance rates for fossil steam and natural gas combined cycle units. It provides options that states can use to adopt either rate-based or mass-based targets. And it's also very important, provides a lot of flexibility in the compliance options that states can use to achieve their reduction targets. And of course, many states have already been out ahead of EPA on this issue and are already leading but certainly this gives us a powerful tool to leverage and to go beyond those commitments that we have in existing states, as well as to bring along other states that have been laggards. So one of the key components of the Clean Power Plan under Section 111D of the Clean Air Act, EPA is required to determine the best system of emission reductions, or BSER, that has been demonstrated for cutting CO2 emissions from fossil-fired power plants. The BSER for the Clean Power Plan is based on technologies and measures that are already being used by states and utilities around the country. In the final Clean Power Plan, EPA determined that BSER consisted of three main building blocks. One was replacing generation from existing fossil fuel plants with generation from new zero-emitting renewable energy sources like wind and solar. Another was replacing generation from higher-emitting coal plants with lower-emitting generation from natural gas. And finally, reducing the carbon intensity of existing coal plants by improving their efficiency, or otherwise known as their heat rate, at the existing coal plant. So some of these measures are inside the fence, so to speak, at the power plant, and some of them are outside. In determining the best system of emission reduction, EPA considered the ranges of reductions that can be achieved at coal, oil, and gas plants at a reasonable cost by the application of each building block, taking into account how quickly and to what extent the measures encompassed by the building blocks could be used to reduce emissions. Based on the three building blocks, EPA established two national emissions performance rates as BSER, and that was measured as the carbon dioxide a plant may release per unit of electricity generated. The black lines at the top show the interim and 2030 emission performance rates EPA assumed for existing coal and other fossil steam plants, while the red line at the bottom shows these rates for existing natural gas combined cycle plants. The black and red boxes show the steady glide path that was requested by many industry stakeholders to achieve these emission reductions over the 8-year compliance period between 2022 and 2030. It's important to note that EPA was conservative in setting these rates by adopting the least stringent of the reductions from the building block analysis that could be achieved in three major regions of the country. And those regions were basically the eastern half of the country and the western half, and then Texas, which all have sort of independent operating electricity grids. EPA recognized that power plants operate through these broad interconnectional regional grids that determine the generation, transmission, and distribution of power both within and across states. The resulting national performance rates also treat coal and natural gas plants consistently and fairly wherever they're located in the country. This slide shows how each state's final emissions rate target in 2030 falls in between these two national performance rates. These rates reflect state-specific differences in the electricity mixes and the ability to cost-effectively reduce emissions using the three building blocks I mentioned earlier. Note that the states on the far left with higher 2030 rates, such as Montana, North Dakota, West Virginia, and Wyoming, are the most coal-intensive states in the country. In contrast, the states on the far right, like California, Idaho, and several northeastern states, have a higher share of natural gas, renewables, and nuclear in their generation mix. Finally, the bar at the far right of the graph shows that the disparity in these rates between the states is far less in the final rule that EPA put out versus the proposed rule. And that was an area in the proposed rule where EPA received some significant criticism from the states and from different utilities because of that wider range. So the final rule makes an important improvement to address that concern that was raised, but while still treating states, differently because of their generation mixes. So while the BSER was limited to the three building blocks I told you about earlier, the states actually have a much wider menu of options to choose at their disposal to achieve compliance with the rule. In addition to the building blocks that I mentioned, this includes investing in energy efficiency, bringing under construction nuclear power plants online, as well as a variety of market-based trading approaches. And it's also important to note that states are free to mix and match these options and to tailor them to their specific energy mix and policy preferences. A part of the rule that we worked on very extensively around the renewables compliance issues, the final rule that EPA put out significantly strengthened the role of renewables under the Clean Power Plan. And that was a key ask from not only us, but many other stakeholders in the process that pointed out that the draft rule had significantly underestimated the role of renewables as a cost-effective option. In terms of the basic eligibility of technologies, it really covers the full suite of renewable energy technologies. However, in the final rule, EPA is only allowing new or incremental renewable energy sources coming online after December 31st, 2012 to be eligible starting in 2022. The existing renewable resources from non-hydro renewables are captured in each state's 2012 emissions baseline already. Another important thing was that both utility scale and behind the meter projects are eligible for compliance, subject to pretty stringent tracking, monitoring, and verification protocols. Finally, I wanted to highlight that the EPA did recognize that some biomass feedstocks could play a role in reducing CO2 emissions and therefore could be used for compliance. However, not all forms of biomass are expected to be approvable. EPA actually has pretty strong language in the rule that's requiring state plans to identify very specific monitoring, verification, and enforcement approaches to ensure that qualified biomass feedstocks actually achieve emission reductions and are produced and used sustainably. EPA also specifies two main pathways for compliance. One is through a rate-based target and the other is a mass-based target for CO2 emissions. Both of these options provide and allow for intra and interstate trading to help achieve compliance and lower costs with the rule. In terms of the rate-based pathway, there's different options that states can pursue. One is what's a so-called two-rate approach, where you meet those national rates at each plant that I was showing earlier, but that those reductions can be achieved either by reducing emissions at the plant or by investing in emission reductions at other locations, including other states. And that can be done either by directly making the investment in those reductions or by purchasing emission reduction credits from others. States can also adopt emission rate limits that are basically a blended rate across all the units. As far as mass-based approaches go, these approaches have been applied and successful through existing programs like the Federal Acid Rain and the cross-state smog programs, as well as at the state and regional level in California and the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. They basically, how they work is that there's a limit on how many tons a plant or multiple plants can emit in a year, and then the states or multiple states working together issue emission allowances for each ton of CO2 emitted. And states have the option to either auction the allowances or they can distribute them by other means. And as we've seen in the Northeast in the RIGI system, the revenues can also be used to fund energy efficiency and renewable energy or customer rebates or other things. The mass-based approach can be used either just with existing units or with a new source complement that would incorporate, for example, new natural gas combined cycle plants. If states choose the option without the new source complement, they do have to demonstrate to EPA that they're addressing issues around potential leakage of emissions from states choosing to build new natural gas power plants and from other states where the electricity may be sold across state lines. The state measures plan that's listed at the far bottom is something that states can also choose under a mass-based approach that would include other sectors like the industrial sector or transportation or things like that. They can also include existing state laws such as renewable electricity standards, energy efficiency resource standards, and other types of policies like that. But these plans, EPA requires these plans to include enforceable backup limits to make sure that the emissions are being achieved. Some additional features that were part of the Clean Power Plan, EPA really encouraged multi-state cooperation and specified, has some pretty detailed recommendations around how regions and states can be trade ready in their compliance pathways. They also included several provisions to make sure that we're maintaining reliability, not only through having a longer compliance period, but also by providing a safety valve as well as through coordination with federal agencies and with the regional transmission organizations. They strongly encourage early action. Jeremy will be talking a little bit more about that. Environmental justice and worker transition assistance are also addressed in the plan. It also includes a federal implementation plan that serves as a backstop for states that decide that states that are opposed to doing this, that might not adopt their own plan, will be subject to a federal plan by EPA. And finally, the plan really does take into account some of the international commitments that the U.S. is making to reduce CO2 emissions and global warming emissions from all sectors that will be leading up to the Paris talks that are coming up soon. So in terms of the impacts of the Clean Power Plan, EPA did a pretty comprehensive cost-benefit analysis, and they determined that the plan would cut carbon by millions of tons per year and generate climate benefits reaching about $20 billion in the year 2030. To calculate the climate benefits, the EPA used the social cost of carbon, which is an official projection that the federal government uses that represents the cost imposed by climate change impacts, such as things like property damage from increased flood risks, wildfires, things like that. While the primary goal of the Clean Power Plan was to reduce CO2 emissions, the EPA also expects the rule to deliver between 14 to 34 billion in annual health benefits in 2030 by reducing exposure to fine particulates and ozone pollution. EPA estimates that these reductions in those harmful pollutants will prevent up to 3,600 premature deaths. You can see the numbers on the left-hand side of the screen for the health benefits across a wide range of things there that are beneficial. EPA estimated that the cost for complying for the plan would range between $5.1 billion to $8.4 billion in 2030. As a result, for every dollar Americans spend on the Clean Power Plan, we will gain up to $4 worth of health benefits. EPA also projects that Americans will save more than $80 per year on their electricity bills by 2030 as investments in energy efficiency technologies offset the slightly higher costs of complying with the rule. This shows the timeline for implementing the Clean Power Plan. The final rule came out in early August. The rule is going to be published in the Federal Register in October, and then there will be a 90-day comment period for the model rule and the federal implementation plan. By September 6th of 2016, states are required to complete their plans or initial plans, or they can request an extension to those plans. So by September of 2018, the states that do get extensions will be required to complete either their state or a multi-state plan, if that's the option they choose, with a progress report due in September of 2017. Before I pass it over to Jeremy, I'm going to just quickly talk about some of the opportunities for renewables and efficiency under the Clean Power Plan. We're at the very early stages of the implementation of the plan, and it remains to be seen whether or not the renewable energy industry can capitalize on some of the opportunities that the Clean Power Plan provides. And the states are now in the driver's seat, and that's why it's so important for all of us to look for ways to encourage the states to use the Clean Power Plan to advance clean energy priorities and goals. Existing clean energy technologies are ready to step up and be a major contributor to the Clean Power Plan compliance. For example, the average cost of solar photovoltaics has dropped by more than 60% between 2009 and 2014, as shown in that chart on the bottom right. The installed cost of large utility-scale systems has fallen by even more, about 70% since 2009, making it competitive with new natural gas plants in many states today with the tax credits that are in place. During the same time, rooftop PV systems for homes and businesses have fallen by about half to two-thirds and are on the verge of reaching grid parity with retail electricity rates in many states. The falling costs, along with state and federal policy support for solar, has led to a record growth in solar PV installations, which is also shown in the bar chart in that graph. The installed capacity of solar in the U.S. has expanded by a factor of 15 between 2009 and 2014. There are now over 20,000 megawatts of solar electric capacity operating in the U.S., which is enough to power more than 4 million average homes. A similar story has been true for wind. We've seen a 66% decline in the cost of generating electricity from wind since 2009, according to the U.S. Department of Energy. And what that means is that the best sites in the U.S. are now cheaper than new coal plants and are competitive with natural gas power plants today. The bars in that chart show the national average reduction in the cost of generating electricity from wind power, while the lines in that graph show some of the regional differences in different parts of the country, with the interior region, the plain states, having the best sites and the cheapest wind power. The drop in the cost is really due to both a reduction in the installed cost of wind as well as an increase in electricity production, otherwise known as the capacity factor, which has occurred due to the use of taller towers, longer blades, and other technology improvements. Wind power now provides more than 12% of the electricity produced in 9 states. Iowa and South Dakota actually get more than 25% of their in-state generation from wind, and Kansas gets more than 20%. In the final rule, EPA, as I mentioned before, the EPA recognized the value of renewables and cutting carbon, and they made several important modifications to the rule that strengthened its role in setting the emission reduction targets. One of the improvements they made was they modified the approach for quantifying BSER from renewables to incorporate historical deployment patterns for renewable technologies. And the demonstrated rates of renewables growth is a sound barometer for what states can achieve in future years, and is something that we recommended in our comments. The EPA also validated its historical deployment approach by modeling the economic potential of renewable energy technologies using a set of improved model assumptions, including an update to their cost and performance assumptions that are consistent with the previous 2 slides that I showed you that are based on actual project experience in the United States. As a result of these changes, EPA identified more than 706,000 gigawatt hours of new renewable energy generation nationally as meeting the economic and technical criteria for inclusion in the final rule. That was more than double the levels of renewables that EPA included in the proposed rule that you can see on the left-hand side of the screen. The amount, when you include existing renewable generation, the amount of renewables is equivalent to about 25% of total current U.S. electricity consumption, that based on the 706,000 gigawatt hours. In addition, because of the updates that EPA adopted for renewables, the modeling that they did, they actually found that this higher level of renewable generation could be achieved at about the same cost as the lower level that they showed on the left there in the draft plan that they included. So those were some really good steps that EPA made to address the concerns that UCF and others had about how they were treating renewables in the rule. So at this point, I'm going to stop and pass it on to Jeremy to explain some of a recent analysis that we did and some other aspects of the rule.
Great, thanks, Steve. The EPA further strengthened the role of renewable energy by recognizing their value in directly displacing fossil fuel generation and, of course, its associated carbon emissions. So they didn't fully account for this effect under the formula for setting state emissions rate targets in the draft proposal. But in the final rule, the agency does indeed credit renewables for emissions reductions from displaced fossil generation. So this change much more accurately reflects what is actually happening when we get more renewables onto the power grid. And it has a meaningful impact in tightening the Clean Power Plan's emissions rates. And it also sends a clear signal to state policymakers and utilities that renewables should be treated on par with other emissions reductions solutions when the compliance plans are developed. And so on the compliance side, the Clean Power Plan offers at least 2 additional features that will accelerate the growth of renewables nationwide. So first, as Steve sort of hinted at earlier, the final rule paves the way for states who choose to do so to design compliance strategies that are trading ready. That is, that they provide the opportunity to use out-of-state credits under rate-based plans or allowances under mass-based plans to meet those emissions reductions requirements. And this offers a significant opportunity for states to tap into regional or national markets for the most cost-effective renewable energy resources that are available. And so the second way is that the second way that the EPA is helping accelerate renewables deployment is through the creation of what they're calling the Clean Energy Incentive Program. So in an effort to spur early investments in renewable energy, the CEIP offers states credits for renewable generation in the years 2020 and 2021 ahead of the Clean Power Plan's 2022 start date from wind and solar projects, as well as from energy efficiency investments in low-income communities that start construction after a state's compliance plan is finalized, which would be at the very latest September of 2018. So this program serves double duty as a reward to states for staying on schedule and completing and submitting their compliance plans, and it also serves as a tool to help limit a rush to natural gas in state compliance, a concern that EPA acknowledged in the final rule. And so ultimately, this voluntary program should give states a jump start on their compliance strategies and help keep the momentum in renewables and efficiency deployment going. So what's the size of the market opportunity for renewable energy and energy efficiency deployment under the Clean Power Plan? One way to evaluate that is to determine how much of the emissions reduction requirements are embedded in legal and regulatory decisions that have already been made by states. So that is things that they've already committed to, and which we'd fully expect would be incorporated into state compliance plans. So this could include things like, for example, the states that have existing power plant carbon caps. So this is AB 32 in California for the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Northeast. There are also, it would also include the 29 states that have mandatory renewable electricity standards in place. And collectively, these RESs are expected to drive between 3,000 and 7,000 megawatt hours of new renewables capacity each year through 2020. 24 states also have energy efficiency resource standards requiring as much as 2% reductions in power use per year through investments in efficiency in homes, businesses, and in industrial processes. In addition, at least 300 coal generating units in 39 states have either retired since 2012, which was the baseline year for the targets set by the Clean Power Plan, or those plants are scheduled to close through 2030. And so what replaces that retiring coal generation will also be important in determining the level of emissions reductions achieved. Largely this so far has been with natural gas. And finally, existing commitments to curb carbon emissions can include the 3 states that currently have nuclear power capacity under construction, and those are Tennessee, Georgia, and South Carolina. And so when you add up all of those existing commitments, you'll see that quite a few states are actually well aligned with the Clean Power Plan's targets and are making good progress towards their 2022 benchmarks. This map is from an analysis that several of my colleagues and I released in August, showing that there are 31 states that will be at least halfway toward meeting their 2022 benchmarks, just from these existing commitments that I've just described. And of this group, 21 states are on track to surpass their 2022 benchmarks. Nationally, states collectively together are about 68% of the way towards being in compliance with those 2022 benchmarks. So in the very near term, the Clean Power Plan will have a more modest impact on driving new renewables and efficiency, which makes the Clean Energy Incentive Program all the more important for getting those early investments in renewables and efficiency. Now looking out to 2030, much more work needs to be done above and beyond current commitments in order to meet those state targets. In 2030, 20 states will be more than halfway toward meeting their targets based on those existing commitments, and 16 of those states are on track to surpass their 2020 targets. And you can see in the, on the map here, this includes California, RGGI, and a few other clean energy leaders, including the Pacific Northwest and also Minnesota. So nationally, the states collectively are about 35% of the way towards complying with those 2030 targets. So as we said at the outset, states are really in the driver's seat when it comes to how renewables are used and to what extent as a compliance option. So the EPA really has prioritized the role of renewable energy to the extent that they could as a cost-effective solution for cutting carbon. And now it's time for the states to step up and prioritize renewables and efficiency in their compliance plans, and that includes the use of complementary policies. So states have many options for ensuring that renewables are accelerated and prioritized as a compliance option. And some of those things include strengthening renewable electricity standards. As I mentioned, a bunch of states already have those. How could they be strengthened? Net metering policies, tax incentives for renewables, financing mechanisms such as green banks that could be used to leverage private capital in the development of renewables and also in efficiency programs, investments in transmission technologies, and coordinating with regional grid operators. So let me turn it back over to Dave, who's going to talk for a second about how you can get involved.
Hey, thanks, Jeremy. I just wanted to touch briefly on a few points about how you can help to make sure that your own state seizes on this really historic opportunity to act on climate change and ramp up clean energy. A few ideas on the slide here. Really important right now is educating the broader public and even the media and reporters about the fact that the Clean Power Plan exists and also its benefits. I think what we're seeing in particular over the past year since the rule was proposed was a pretty coordinated media campaign by opponents of the rule in the fossil fuel industry that often played out in the opinion pages of local and national newspapers. And our own network has been really valuable in pushing back on some of those misleading claims, but also making sure that the good news about what the Clean Power Plan can deliver is getting out there in an accurate and truthful way. Informing policymakers, Jeremy and Steve mentioned that sort of the next phase in the Clean Power Plan's development is really for states to start work on state compliance plans, which will detail how exactly they plan to meet the Clean Power Plan's goals for reducing carbon dioxide emissions and increasing clean energy. So there's a variety of different areas where policymakers will be involved in that. Governors will certainly play a leading role in guiding those compliance plan processes, as will state air regulators. But there'll also be a role for state legislators who will maybe be tasked with actually doing things like increasing renewable energy and energy efficiency standards in their state. It'll be also important to monitor, make sure that special interests aren't trying to enact legislation that could actually inhibit states' ability to meet the Clean Power Plan at the same time. Attorneys generals, members of Congress, and also candidates running for all sorts of different public offices are also important people to reach out to at this point and really just let them know the basics on what the Clean Power Plan is, but also how it's an opportunity for your state to act on climate change and speed up the transition to a clean energy economy. One of the more direct ways that we'll be seeing in most states soon is the actual start of public comment periods and hearings on state compliance plans. And that'll be a great way just to plug in your expertise into actual decision-making processes that will lead to really the details of how states are going to meet the Clean Power Plan's goals. At this point, I think we'll transition to the Q&A. And we got a nice slate of questions that people submitted during and before the webinar here. I think the first question I'll pose to you, Steve. How do you see lobbying for more support for solar power related to the Clean Power Plan?
Yeah, well, let me answer that question and just including solar, but more generally too for renewables policies. Well, for solar in particular and wind, the federal tax credits have been really important, and those are set to expire at the end of the eligibility for the tax credits it runs out at the end of 2016 for projects that are for wind projects that are under construction and for solar projects that are developed. So that's a really important thing to do, is to support the extension of the federal tax credits. At the state level, it's also important to support the states that are seeing the most development of solar have the most supportive policies, particularly renewable electricity standards, and some states have carve-outs in their renewable standards specifically for solar that have been driving development. Tax credits and incentives at the state level too are also important. Other sort of at the state level, the policies for renewables, there's a menu of different options. Clearly the ones that are the tried and true ones, like renewable standards, are things that we're advocating for. But in some states where it might be difficult to increase a standard or even adopt one if you don't have one, we're also encouraging things like the adoption of financing mechanisms like green banks that have been successful in some states, and we have a couple of publications out on those as well. And also for promoting the use of energy efficiency to advancing state policies for that as well is really important.
Excellent. As a follow-up question, this one's actually about the episodic nature of wind and solar energy production. What are the best paths to even that out? And a secondary question that's related, what work needs to be done on energy storage technologies?
Yeah, in terms of the variable output of wind and solar, there's just been a tremendous amount of studies and analysis done on that, and really it hasn't been a big problem up until this point with the levels of wind and solar that we have, and that's including in certain places that even on a daily or hourly basis we've achieved very high levels of penetration. And the main reason for that is because we are able to incorporate those technologies into kind of a broader, wider grid that can help balance out those fluctuations with other sources of generation and with demand response and things like that. And the regional transmission organizations and many utilities around the country have done analyses looking at much higher levels of penetration from wind and solar across the country, and have demonstrated that they can be incorporated at those high levels at a very modest cost for balancing and other things. Another question we got in had to do with storage, and certainly storage is another potential option for helping to integrate wind and solar, and there's been a lot of exciting technology developments around storage. Clearly, we need to incentivize that to help bring down the cost of solar. It's still fairly expensive, and most of the studies I referred to before showed that we don't really need storage in a major way yet, but down the road when we do achieve higher levels of renewables, that it will be needed. So we do have some time, but certainly trying to incentivize improvements in that area as well as to drive down the cost are really important.
Excellent. We have a few questions here about energy efficiency and the Clean Power Plan. While energy efficiency is no longer an official building block, can states still use energy efficiency measures as part of their state compliance plans? And a few related questions to that. How would the choice of a rate-based or mass-based approach limit efforts to or promotion of energy efficiency? Do you want to take that one, Jeremy?
Sure. So absolutely, energy efficiency is still something that states could use in order to meet their Clean Power Plan targets, even though it wasn't included as a building block in setting the targets. And EPA has been very clear about providing that flexibility to states to do what they felt was best for their own situations in order to meet the targets. And we think that a lot of states will actually probably end up finding that energy efficiency investments will be one of the most cost-effective ways to achieve the targets. There was a couple of questions about how the decision to go rate-based or mass-based might affect efforts to promote energy efficiency. And I think the answer is that the flexibility inherent in the rule would mean that energy efficiency measures would help achieve either target. I think the difference is that in the rate-based system, there's a lot of additional effort that has to go into the measurement and verification procedures to ensure that the efficiency measures are really causing decline in emissions. And there was also a question about how low-income consumers could benefit from the Clean Power Plan, and that's where I point back to the Clean Energy Incentive Program, which actually provides kind of a nudge for states to invest in energy efficiency programs that are in low-income communities. And they do that by providing a state, whatever a state were to accomplish in the years 2020 and 21 in terms of energy efficiency measures in low-income communities, they actually get double credit in terms of complying with the targets. So those measures would actually count for double.
One thing I just wanted to add to what Jeremy was saying too is on the efficiency side is under the rate-based approach, energy efficiency can qualify for emission reduction credits. And as Jeremy said, the authenticity of those has to be verified and so forth. But that is one of the mechanisms in terms of states deciding how to allocate those emission reduction credits to eligible sources like energy efficiency. Under a mass-based system, there's a couple of options. One is similar to what's going on in RGGI right now, which is in terms of them auctioning the allowances and using some of the proceeds. Most of the proceeds from RGGI have gone to energy efficiency, which helps reduce consumer bills, so it helps reduce the cost of compliance too. So that's how, just a couple of examples of how efficiency could play a role under those different types of targets.
Do we know about how many states appear to be favoring a mass-based plan and how many want to include interstate trading?
Right. So it kind of varies. I mean, I think for one thing, states seem to be trying to keep all of their options open at this stage. But we do seem to hear that a lot of states may be leaning towards the mass-based compliance option simply because it's sort of a known quantity. State regulators kind of understand how to handle emissions trading systems through experience with other similar programs, like with the trading for the reduced sulfur emissions that were causing acid rain.
One question for you, Steve. How will increased distributed generation affect power prices?
That's a good question. I think, well, first of all, as I said in my presentation, that distributed generation like solar PV panels, rooftop solar PV can qualify for the Clean Power Plan. I think there's a big debate going on at the state level right now, particularly around net metering, about what impact that those types of systems have on prices as well as sort of non-participant prices. Personally, I've participated in a couple of different studies at the state level, both in Minnesota and Maine, looking at the value of solar. And those studies have sort of more broadly looked at the value to society of developing solar. And in both of those cases, the value that they came up with was significantly higher than retail electricity prices in those states, particularly in Maine. That study showed a very high value. So it's a little bit misleading to just talk about how solar is going to directly affect prices and non-participant costs, as one could argue that under net metering, where people are essentially getting the retail rate for electricity, that's actually undervaluing the contribution that solar is making to the system and to society. So I think that issue is going to continue to play out at the state level in different ways, but I just wanted to draw people's attention to that. And certainly another question was related to specifically about how somebody could encourage their utility to embrace that distributed generation, and I think that can be done through some of these policy mechanisms. I do think many utilities are not all that supportive of distributed generation because it reduces their sales and because of the impact that it can have on recovering transmission and distribution charges and so forth. But I think the best way to impact that is through state policy efforts like some of the ones that we discussed, and certainly these value of solar studies that have been used to establish state policies are also a very good approach at really looking at the bigger picture in terms of what it's worth.
This is a related question. How do we get utilities, in this person's case, Mid-American, to embrace distributed energy? And then someone else was actually wondering if there's examples of utilities or other fossil fuel interests that are really embracing the clean power plan that they could point to.
Well, my answer to the previous question was meant to address that question about Mid-American embracing distributed generation. I'm not sure if they necessarily will. I mean, to the extent that I guess in some states, like New York is a good example of it, where they're actually discussing changes to the utility business model and so forth that could result in utilities, a different approach where utilities could benefit from developing and supporting distributed generation. But that's, at its pretty early stages, I would say, and for the most part, utilities are not strongly embracing distributed generation. I guess there are some instances where distributed generation can provide a lower cost option to the utility than investing in more transmission and distribution infrastructure, and that certainly has happened in several cases around the country. What was your other question, Dave? I'm sorry.
This was more pertinent to the Clean Power Plan directly. I think there was just a big article in the Wall Street Journal talking about how most utilities are getting ready to implement the Clean Power Plan at this point, and basically were there different utilities or fossil fuel interests that someone could point to when they're making the case for implementing the Clean Power Plan in a strong way to policymakers in their state?
Yeah, I'll say a little bit about that, and then maybe Jeremy can add to it based on his experience in other parts of the country. But I know in some cases utilities have been, supportive or agnostic to it in terms of them showing that, their plans are going to line up very well or even exceed what EPA is requiring. An example of that is Xcel Energy in Minnesota. They just put out their 15-year integrated resource plan that would achieve a 60% reduction in CO2 emissions and has large investments in both wind and solar, and achieves about a 1.5% reduction in electricity use through energy efficiency. So there's utilities like that, and then there's other utilities that are complaining about it or saying that it's not that it's going to be expensive for them to get that far. In the case of Mid-American, which somebody brought up earlier, Mid-American, especially in Iowa, owns a lot of wind power. Potentially states like Iowa and Minnesota that are on track for meeting or exceeding their Clean Power Plan targets can actually sell credits through the trading mechanisms that are in the Clean Power Plan to actually make money off of renewables and other options to reduce emissions.
And I'll just add that I think a lot of utilities would rather have certainty about the rules of the road rather than this long period of uncertainty ahead. So, for example, when I was in Pennsylvania last week, there was a representative from Exelon at a conference that I was attending, and she was saying that they support Pennsylvania putting together a compliance plan and submitting it on time because they'd rather know what's coming than sort of have this long, protracted legal battle over the implementation and over the final rule.
We've got some good questions submitted in from the chat too. In the context of the Clean Power Plan, will there be any geographical limits on carbon trading?
Yeah, so as far as we can tell, the EPA has really tried to preserve the flexibility to states. So there's nothing, and correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, that's in the final final targets is set and the final plan is set forth by the EPA that would prohibit any state from trading allowances or rate credits from any other state. Now, it depends heavily on how states actually put together their compliance plan. So a given state could say, we only want to trade with our neighbors, or we only want to trade with the states in our region, or where that might come into play is with how the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, how those states submit their plans. But there's nothing that I'm aware of in the final rule from EPA that would sort of set any geographical restrictions on trading.
Someone is interested in finding information on where they can find out where their state is in terms of the state compliance plan process, and then moving forward, what types of goals they may be thinking about setting, and information they're considering as they develop the compliance plan.
So most states many states are trying to put together stakeholder processes that are meant to engage the public and stakeholders in what they should consider doing as part of their response. So typically, you would go to the state's Department of Environment. So some states call it the Department of Environmental Quality or Department of Environmental Protection. The name sort of varies from state to state, but it's basically where the air regulators sit. They're the ones that would ultimately are responsible for putting together a response to the EPA for this rule, and they'll be working pretty closely, hopefully, with the energy regulators, so the state public utility commissions. So those two places, I think, are the places where you want to go to kind of figure out where your state is in terms of their process. They should have things on their websites that sort of talk about how they're, what sort of comment periods they're doing, what sorts of listening sessions they're putting together, and sort of the timeline that they're thinking in terms of getting a plan together.
And just to add to that a little bit, there's some states that are even suing EPA over the Clean Power Plan, but many of those states are actually have processes underway, stakeholder processes to develop implementation plans, because depending on the outcome of the lawsuits, they don't want to be subject to a federal plan from EPA, but would rather have control of their own plan. So even though you hear about all the states that are suing EPA, many of them are actually moving forward in parallel to their lawsuits.
I think we have time for one more question, and then I'll just make some closing remarks. This individual is wondering, is there a way for people to benefit from wind and solar even if they aren't able to install it on their own property? And sort of a related question of, are there ways for low-income customers to benefit from renewable energy even if they can't install it, say, on their own apartment?
Well, yeah. I mean, on the first question, many states have things like community solar gardens, where you can, invest in solar without it having actually be on your property, and receive benefits from that. Is just one example. What did you say about energy efficiency, Dave? And I'm sorry, I missed that part of the question.
Oh, no problem. It was just sort of framing that question in the context of low-income housing.
Oh, low-income housing, yeah. Well, there's definitely entities that can, be aggregators, or, state programs like low-income weatherization programs and things like that could potentially play a role in helping to, in addition to that, green banks has also been seen as a mechanism for potentially supporting investments in solar on low-income properties. There's some really good studies that have come out recently from the Clean Energy Group in Vermont showing how that could work. So there's different ways that you could take part in that. Another thing on the solar side is there are third-party arrangements that could be made, and leasing solar systems to have them put on your roof without paying anything out up front are other things that you could do along those lines.
Great. I think we'll wrap up there for today. I just wanted to let you know to be on the lookout in your email inboxes. I will circulate the slides later this week, as well as specific opportunities and recommendations on how you might be able to get involved around the Clean Power Plan in your own state. Thanks again for joining, and we'll be signing off now.